Hey guys, it's time for another recording, Chapter 24, Key Questions. Starting with key question number 1, how did land grants lead to widespread corruption in the railroad industry? Well, when you think about it, it's very expensive to build as many rails as America was trying to build in this time period. And so it took the government stepping in and granting land to them, to those railroad companies, for them to be able to afford it. The plan was for them to sell it afterward to make profit and pay back all the debts they incurred. The problem is that where there is government handouts, there will be people taking advantage of the system. And so many people and railroad owners began bribing congressmen to give them more land or finding ways like building their rails in a specific manner to get as much land as possible and then sell it for massive amounts of profit. Most of the transcontinental railroads and major railroads ended up going bankrupt anyway, which tells you that they were there for the cash grab of land grants. The most famous example of corruption caused by land grants and the railroad industry was the Credit Mobilier scandal, in which a congressman and his cronies pocketed $73 million for what should have been just a $50 million railroad. So how was the Transcontinental Railroad completed? Well, again, our government financed it through land grants. They built from two separate directions, beginning in the east with the Union Pacific Railroad, and then in the west, the Central Pacific Railroad. Who helped to build it was immigrant groups, specifically the Irish and the Chinese. Both groups were able to labor for several years on those rails and then would continue to go on to help forge our entire railroad network. So the immigrants played a major part in that. And then in 1865, they finally completed, 1869, they completed construction in Utah, completing the first transcontinental railroad. Question 3. What role did James J. Hill and Cornelius Vanderbilt play in the development of the U.S. rail system? Well, James J. Hill built the Great Northern Railroad, which connected the northern part of our country from east to west. Cornelius Vanderbilt, on the other hand, he connected the northeastern section of our country through rails, specifically beginning in the New York region and eventually spreading out towards Chicago. How are these men different? Well, James J. Hill, he made a lot of money off his railroad, but he did it without any land grants. And he also did it by helping the immigrants settle in the area around his railroad so that his railroad could be successful. Vanderbilt, on the other hand, is considered one of the robber barons of the era and one of the men who took advantage of the public to make as much money as he could. Now, that's not without its benefits. He did build a large network of rails in the region, and he did connect New York to Chicago. He did standardize the size of track and invested in steel to make sure his rails were safer and became the industry standard. Regardless, Vanderbilt's remembered more for his corruption and his cruel business practices, the way that he was such a cutthroat businessman that really made many more victims than, I guess, people who worked well with him. Number 4, how did railroads impact American society? It actually impacted us in a lot of ways, much like Henry Clay predicted with his American system. By connecting our entire nation through rails and with infrastructure, we're able to connect the raw materials, the factories, and most of all connect all those markets together so we could create a massive economic growth in this time period. It also increased the demand for steel. Moving beyond that, it creates mining opportunities in agriculture. Both those types of economies are stimulated and grow. Boom towns and ghost towns out west encourage massive amounts of immigration. As mentioned, we had Chinese and Irish immigrants coming to our nation. But that growth of manufacturing also called for more workers to flood our nation. Then you have the ecological impact, the fact that we had to destroy our environment to build it, clearing lumber, destroying or clearing paths through mountain ranges. Of course, poor buffalo were the victims of the settlement out west and the building of those. And you also have the natives being quite upset. As far as migration as well, you have the immigration migration, but you also have settlers flooding the Great Plains because they're finally connected. They're not as isolated as they once were if they were to move on the Great Plains and become farmers. Now they're connected through those railroad systems. And finally, you could say that it also connected our country through an actual standardized time. We create time zones to better manage the logistics of rail travel. Getting on to number 5, you could say one last thing is it helped create the robber barons. Robber barons were men like Jay Gould who used corruption in the industry to take money from the government and take money from investors and from the public. And they didn't care who their victims were. They didn't care how many people they hurt. They were there to make money. The most famous quote, of course, comes from Cornelius Vanderbilt, who said, and I quote, the public be damned. That alone tells you a lot about their attitude toward the people and the money that they were making. So how did citizens fight to limit the power of these robber barons, especially in the railroad industry? Specifically, farmers came together in what we call Granger laws. We'll talk later about the Populist Party, how that leads to progressives fighting. But they were able to pass state laws that restricted railroads. The problem is that unfortunately, the Supreme Court and the government as a whole really wasn't on their side. Supreme Court decides in the Wabash case that because it is interstate trade, only the federal government can control it. And so their efforts to create state laws to restrict railroad abuse were limited. In 1887, Congress does create the Interstate Commerce Act, and in class I told you to write down the ICC for the Interstate Commerce Commission. And it was meant to prohibit the rebates and pools. Rebates, handouts, and discounts given to big businesses. Pools, the ability of railroad companies to come together to agree on high prices. The ICC was meant to rein in those abuses. Unfortunately, it wasn't effective, and it won't be until the Progressive Era that we really rein in big business. Number 7, why was the U.S. able to go from the 4th to the 1st in world manufacturing by 1890? There's several reasons for this. Transportation, naturally. Natural resources as well. The fact that no one had taken our natural resources. Transportation allows those resources to get where it needs to be. Massive amounts of liquid capital from our businessmen. Inventors like Thomas Edison create products and items that not only benefit our society, but also create massive economic growth. And finally, a large labor source. Having immigrants come from around the world to our country help fill in the spots needed to build those railroads, to work those factories, to build our cities. They did a lot of the hard work which created the economic boom that our country sees. And so all of those come together to create an economy and a nation that's first in world manufacturing. So now we're going to talk about the 3 major businessmen that we seem to remember from this time period. And they're all quite different. Carnegie himself is an immigrant who comes to America and works in a factory for the first several years of his life. He climbs his way to the top and eventually is the first to invest in the mass production of steel through something called the Bessemer process. Creating the Carnegie Steel Company, he used something called vertical integration. He owned every step of the steelmaking process, from the mines to the factories to the transportation and sales. And so every step of the process of steel made money only for Carnegie. Rockefeller, on the other hand, he saw in the oil boom in America, he saw an opportunity to invest in oil refinement. Because he focused on oil refinery, he did not have to hunt down the oil. He did not have to dig it up, create oil rigs, and that was a lot of the work out of his hands. He used what we call horizontal integration. And in class, we talked about the importance of the word trust. He would buy out his competitors, the oil refinery industry, and bought out so many that he ended up with about 95% of the oil refinery industry under his company, Standard Oil. So Rockefeller used a kind of cruel means. He would undercut them. He would bribe and spy on other companies. Congressmen were under his control. The biggest thing he would do is just simply cut off the shipping from his competitors until they had to sell to him. And finally, you have J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan was a banker. He inherited his dad's banking business and grew it even more. J.P. Morgan used what we call the interlocking directorate. He would choose an industry, and he would invest enough in the major competitors in that industry to have a director sitting on their board of directors. And he would create cooperation through those companies, similar to what we mentioned in the pool earlier, the pool idea from railroads. And he would have them cooperate so that prices stayed high and everyone in the industry made profit. And he would go throughout the different industries with this process to make everyone a lot of money. So all 3 of these men made a lot of money, and our names we still recognize today. And they all made their money differently, but they are certainly important figures in the Gilded Age and the Age of Industrialization. And finally, these attitudes that come around in these movements. Number 9, social Darwinism and gospel of wealth. Social Darwinism comes from, of course, Charles Darwin's ideas about nature, but it's really a European philosopher who uses the phrase survival of the fittest. The idea that you are in control of your own destiny, that only the fittest survive. Businessmen took this idea and said, we deserve to be where we are because we worked harder. Maybe God blessed us with greater talents or greater intellect. Either way, they said that it was their hard work and their abilities which made them successful. This changes their attitude because then they look at those who are beneath them, whether it be their competitors or whether it be those who work in their actual factories. They look down on them and have no pity for their situation because in their minds, they deserve what they have received. They needed to work harder or be smarter or do something to climb out of their hole. And so this leads to the mistreatment of workers and the cutthroat activities we see in America in all the industries. And then you have Carnegie, who has a different idea about this. He recognizes that maybe he was lucky or maybe he was blessed to make it where he was, but he believed it was the responsibility of the wealthy to use their money to improve society. And so what he did, even though he sold his company for $400 million, he ended up spending $350 million of those dollars on creating opportunities for the poor. This included creating libraries, creating schools, and training opportunities. That way, if someone wanted to climb up out of poverty, but they were born in a poor family or lived in the tenements of, say, East Side New York City, they would be able to climb out because he had provided an opportunity for them. So that's it for Chapter 24. I hope that you're able to get a lot out of it, and I hope that you learned a lot about the cruel business practices of the time period. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email or ask. If not, I'll see you in class, and you can ask me then. Thank you.